Very excited to have you all here for this event, Retrofitting Urban Precincts, Creating Livable Post-Carbon Communities. It's presented to you by the Post-Carbon Research Centre. There's a lot of post-carbon in this title. I'm going to get to that in a moment. Priya Rajagopalan, the director of the Post-Carbon Research Centre, is here somewhere. There might be other members of our cluster committee as well, of the executive, so thanks for coming along, but mostly thanks to all of you for coming along, for joining us in discussion, and of course, and I'll get to this in a moment, a special thanks to the people who are going to be up on the panel and talking to you about the issues of the day. My name's Joe Hurley. I'm a professor here at RMIT University in Sustainability and Urban Planning, and I'm also the co-lead of the Precincts cluster within the Post-Carbon Research Centre, co-lead with Trivess, who's going to be up here on the panel in a little bit. So welcome. It's going to be a fun conversation, I hope. Looking forward to contributions from the room as well when we get to the panel session. I'd like to, on behalf of myself first of all, but also of the Research Centre and RMIT University, acknowledge that we're meeting here on the unceded lands of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders and ancestors past and present. Important, I think, in the context of the discussion today, which is all about land and place, to really centre the fact that this is unceded land, to acknowledge that we're in a treaty process now, and that I hope all of us do what we can to support that process and be part of dealing with the fact that we have no recognised co-stewardship and governance with First Nations people here in Melbourne. So, excited to be here. As I mentioned, Post-Carbon Research Centre is kind of sponsoring this event. It's a new research centre, which I'll say a quick few words about, that started at RMIT. New research centre building on existing capability. It's bringing together capability across the university, focused on built environments with this kind of idea of post-carbon. Post-carbon, what is that, you ask? That's what people ask me all the time. It's not about moving beyond having carbon at all. Carbon is a fundamental element in the universe. We're stuck with it. Mostly for good, I think. But post-carbon here talks more about a vision, a journey, a trajectory to life here, particularly for us in cities, in built environments, beyond a dependence on carbon-intensive fossil fuels. So this is about decarbonisation, yes, weaning ourselves off our dependence on carbon-emitting sources of fuel and practices of building, but also about the future of what is our cities, what are our communities beyond living on those sources of materials, fuel that are dependent on carbon. So it is speaking to that transition and that future, and embracing pathways to more sustainable, equitable and resilient futures in built environments. So in the centre, we're bringing together capability across the university. It's a multidisciplinary focus. So we've got researchers and practitioners from engineering, from architecture, from urban design, from geospatial sciences, from property construction, from the social sciences, coming together and trying to work through complex challenges of transition to that post-carbon ideal. So that's the Post-Carbon Research Centre. Within that, we've got this group focused on precincts. We work with the other areas of the centre because many of the challenges we're leaning into are multifaceted, complex and require multidisciplinary expertise, but our focus here is on this idea of precincts today. Precincts is another term that we can think of in a variety of different ways, and maybe sometimes hard to pin down. But for us, it's about calling out and identifying specific areas within our urban landscapes that have a kind of sensible level of focus upon them, because of their geographic scale, yes, but also because of the character of these places, what they do, what they're for, how we understand them as individuals and communities in our cities. They're places that perhaps have more intensified activity, use and development. And they're really important places to single out and to look at when we're trying to engage with the complexity, the interactivity, the potential synergies and co-benefits, but also the conflicts and trade-offs that we make in trying to develop the good city, to try and achieve that kind of post-carbon ideal of equitable, livable, resilient and sustainable. So a precinct gives us the scale at which to look really proactively, productively at complexity in the cities, and that's what we're wanting to engage with today. And we're at a bit of a moment, I think, here in Victoria with precincts. There is an upswing of intensification of development in identified precincts, things like activity centres, big picture developments, big precinct developments like Fishman's Bend or Arden Macaulay, the suburban rail loop and the centres associated with that. And in the last few weeks, we've seen the drop of some really significant policy and strategy documents from state government, a new plan for Victoria, new activity centres called out and structure plans released for the suburban rail loop, likely station locations. Got a new draft infrastructure plan from Infrastructure Victoria. And all of these documents in various ways engage, certainly with development, certainly with housing, but a lot of it's about precincts, about where this needs to go and what nature it should take in terms of the change of our cities over time. So for us, this is a welcome focus. Potential benefits here for housing supply, for affordable housing, if we do it well, for urban sustainability, for livable places, for things that leave a legacy in our city. But they don't just happen, good precincts, good places, by accident. It takes a lot of careful thought, process, decision-making, action, investment. And from where I sit, the dominance of the scare quotes housing crisis is sometimes diminishing effort on that integrated thinking, integrated approach to getting that legacy we need for precincts in our city over the next 10 years of investment. So today's discussion is about broadening our view and thinking about how we create good places, sustainable places, moving beyond dependence on carbon while we go through this process of investing in housing in precincts in our city. And reflecting with some of the panel members in our pre-chat and some of the members of the advisory committee of the centre, some have the view, and I think it's got some reasonable substance to it, that we don't do precincts particularly well in Australia. We do good buildings sometimes, we do good infrastructure sometimes, but in terms of knitting it all together in a cohesive, strategically directed way, maximising co-benefits and synergies, dealing with conflicts, minimising trade-offs, not something that we do particularly well when compared, say, with other jurisdictions. And Europe is singled out here, Northern Europe, England perhaps. But there's a question there as to why that is the case. Why do we struggle to do precincts well? We set the regulatory environment, we set the decision-making environment, the investment environment, but then it's kind of like, right, off you go, do the buildings, do the infrastructure, do the services, and hopefully it kind of works and we don't butt into each other. How do we move beyond that and think more holistically in integrated ways to get really good precincts in our cities? Now that's what we're diving into in this discussion today, and we've got the people here to do that, which is exciting. So we've got two parts to the agenda really after me sort of going on for a little bit. We're going to have some brief research vignettes, some presentations on active research projects from researchers that are working within the Post-Carbon Research Centre, with other collaborators and with industry partners to kind of further characterise this focus on precincts and post-carbon precincts. And then we're going to move on to a panel discussion, which will take up the majority of the time, where we've got experts from industry and research to really kind of tease out some of these issues. I've got some questions that I'm proposing to throw at them and see what they come up with, but I'll also be calling on you in the audience for questions if you have them. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm excited to get going. I'm going to move on now to the research presentations. I'll find my little clicker. We've got 3 little presentations to give from Andrew Carre, Hugh Stanford and Rebecca Yang, and we're going to go in that order because that's the order I've put the slides in the slide deck. So Andrew, if you'd like to come up. Andrew is a senior researcher within the School of Property Construction and Project Management and lecturer, and also a researcher within the Post-Carbon Research Centre. He's going to be talking about the Nightingale Precinct and post-occupancy evaluation moving beyond building to precinct kind of implications, I think. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Joe. Let's see if I've got this working. I do. Fantastic. I don't know how long I've been working with Joe for, but he knows how to say my last name, which is an indication. So anyway, good to see you all this evening. I won't speak beyond my time allotted because I really want to hear what Hugh and Rebecca are going to say. But I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about a project that we've been doing on the Nightingale precinct in the north of Melbourne, and we started life as a post-occupancy evaluation of an apartment building and an apartment design that adopts a real high-performance approach to apartments. We looked at 6 buildings, 18 apartments, and we looked at them over 12 months. And we wanted to understand how do they perform. Nightingale, you've probably heard of it, has been written about quite a bit. It's considered to be a different way of doing apartment development. There is a Nightingale housing model that has its own ethos associated with the development, and we wanted to actually go in there and have a look at, well, how does it actually perform? We were lucky enough, Trivess Moore and Myla Andamon, who I've worked with on this project, Trivess was able to secure some funding from SV for us to actually have a really close look at the buildings. So the life of our project actually started life as an assessment really of apartments, dwellings, this apartment resident system, to see what do people think of these apartments, how do they perform. But that involves looking at buildings more broadly. We have 6 buildings here in the precinct, and then you have the precinct itself. So I probably had this slide a bit backwards. It probably reads from right to left and not left to right. But one of the things that was interesting when Joe asked me to talk today was just thinking about what the precinct actually does for our assessment of building performance. And in many ways, it presents the boundary conditions of our study. It gives us the outdoor environment. The buildings are all exposed to a very similar outdoor environment, a similar acoustic environment. Air quality outside is similar, and that's going to drive performance inside the dwelling as well. We're also looking at similar sorts of residents in these buildings as well. They've been attracted to the Nightingale model, so they may share similar ethical perspectives around sustainability and the built environment. And we're also talking about people who like Brunswick and like riding bikes and those sorts of things. There's a lot of similarity that comes along with the precinct. And what this allows us to do is to think about distinctions. We're looking at a similar sort of precinct situation. If we see differences between apartments, we can start to say, well, that's probably not to do with outdoor conditions, because the outdoor conditions are similar. It may have something to do with that particular apartment design or that particular building design. It also allows us to see what's consistent. What is the precinct actually driving into dwelling outcomes? And I've got a real simple sort of example of that. And you wouldn't think that was a simple slide, but it is the acoustic sort of profile for a day, I think in December sometime, for a number of those apartments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 apartments. The orange lines are the outdoor noise levels, and the blue lines are the indoor noise levels. And what you see when you line them all up in time is the way they all are responding to a boundary condition that's happening at a precinct scale. That train at which station is it? I can't remember. But anyway, it's not Jewel Station. Anyway, I should have remembered that one. Is it Anstey Station? Okay, that train, what you're seeing there in terms of the peak is that point where it blows its horn every time they stop and start. Well, that's right. Yeah, yes, John. So you see the effect that boundary condition is having on that low-level apartment scale, and how important it is, that we take consideration of that. And this chart here is my last one I wanted to show you. It's just showing you the way carbon dioxide inside the apartment moves up and down over the course of days. And the peaks here you're seeing are first things in the morning. So this resident in particular is shutting their apartment right up through the evening. They don't want the doors open. That probably has something to do with the precinct. It may be acoustics, it may be their perspectives around security and safety, it may be other things, but we see this sort of consistency around behaviour that we probably need to understand better and probably justifies more research into the future. So I'm not going to talk through that last slide. I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that gives a bit of a feel for what we've been doing there. And I'm going to hand over to, is it Hugh? Are you next?
So as Hugh comes up to get his slides, I'll introduce him. Dr. Hugh Stanford is a research fellow at RMIT, a member of the Post-Carbon Research Centre. Just finished his PhD. Congratulations, Hugh. He's going to be looking at the spaces between buildings, so broadening further out from Andrew, looking at the spaces between. Over to you, Hugh.
Hello. So my research focuses on urban greening, usually, in the spaces between buildings, and how planning at the precinct scale can be valuable for improving social and ecological outcomes. I'm going to present on two projects I've been working on. The first one relates to designing streetscapes to encourage active mobility. This is sort of walking, bike riding, not necessarily jogging, not necessarily just to go to the shops and back, but also increasing the scale of that to include any sort of active mobility, to use the word in the definition, any sort of active sort of behaviour that might happen within streetscapes, and how we can improve these streetscapes to encourage this and improve public health outcomes through those sort of behaviours. The second one is a project I'm looking to how we can plan and manage informal or unplanned green spaces in ways that support biodiversity, habitat connectivity, and people's engagement with nature as well. So the first project, well, I'll come to this slide. The overview is we've partnered with Cancer Council Victoria and their SunSmart project, as well as some other state, local government and industry bodies to investigate how we can design streetscapes to encourage active mobility in a safe and healthy way. Streetscapes are really important spaces because this is where our daily life unfolds. This is where we do our shopping. This is where we meet with people, interact with people. This is where community happens. And this is where we undertake our recreation. And so we need to make sure that these spaces, to encourage people to be as active as possible, are not only inviting, but they are also safe. They're not exposing people to unintended health risks, such as additional UV radiation, excessive urban heat, air pollution, things like that. So these spaces serve the challenge here is these spaces often serve multiple conflicting purposes, and there's a risk of maladaptive outcomes if they're not planned well. So one of the examples that was sort of an inciting idea for this research was this idea that in planning, we're doing a lot to reduce urban heat. One of the ways in which we're looking to reduce urban heat in our environment is by increasing the amount of reflective surfaces around our cities, light-coloured surfaces all around our cities. And the idea that we had was to sort of say, well, the whole idea about this reflective surface approach to planning is it reflects heat out of our cities. And so we can have cooler places, it's not getting trapped in with this urban heat island effect. The problem there, of course, is in reflecting light, you're reflecting UV. And so there's this idea that we had, okay, in planning, are we accidentally exacerbating one problem by trying to resolve a different problem? So this, I think, is an example of how there are lots of different balances, balancing of trade-offs, of risks that Joe talked about earlier. Our project, we're looking to sort of have an investigation of how planning can balance these competing priorities to maximise health co-benefits and reduce the risks specifically for streetscapes and for active mobility within those streetscapes. What we've done so far is we've conducted a pilot project in 2024 which identified the need to coordinate research across multiple fields in informing better urban design. There's a lot of research, and I finally come to this slide, there's a lot of research occurring in disparate fields all across the world. Here is a perfect example on the right. We've got some really left, my right, your left. we've got some really interesting work, which is some agent-based modelling that's been done in the Centre of Urban Research by Afshan Jafari. This is a way of modelling how different individuals might move throughout the city in their active transport. It allows us to, effectively, when it comes to this question of cumulative UV, it allows us to understand what sort of populations, what sort of demographic groups might be more or less exposed to cumulative UV. This is one example of a project that's occurring with its own means, and there's a perfect ability to link it with this idea of health co-benefits and health risks in active mobility. That's just one example in RMIT, and there's many, many different examples all around the world, and I think our pilot project identified a need to have research bring together these disparate fields to have something that's tangible and useful for planners to make more informed decisions about how our streetscapes and our urban spaces are planned to be healthier, to be safer places. We are now seeking further funding to expand on this work and watch this space effectively. The second one, quickly get through, is a question on the greening of these leftover spaces, these informal spaces. This lines a little bit more with my initial PhD research, but it has extended past that. We've partnered with researchers at Curtin University in West Australia to explore how underutilised green spaces associated with the infrastructure, such as railway easements or utility easements. This is a high-pressure gas pipeline up in Thornbury somewhere. It's not sort of considered a path. You can see a little path that kind of runs through it. That is just a goat path that people have sort of walked through. There's no official infrastructure. We're looking at how we might be able to plan and green these spaces to improve biodiversity outcomes. Of course, animals don't see property boundaries. They don't care if it's a house or if it's a utility easement or if it's a streetscape. And so when it comes to planning for nature in our cities, we need to think beyond individual buildings and beyond individual infrastructure projects into broader precincts generally. And so that's what we're doing. The key question we're asking is how can we intentionally design and manage these spaces in order to support broader ecological networks? The way we're doing this is we're using existing methods to model ecological connectivity across all of Greater Melbourne, and then we're testing some different modelling scenarios to some different urban greening scenarios, specifically on railway and utility easements, to see how these spaces could improve precinct-wide connectivity. Specifically, some of those ideas, some of those scenarios might be thinking about how we can increase native mid-storey vegetation on these spaces, maybe by sort of 10%, 20% increases. Imagine these as sort of hypothetical locations the council could go out and plant a little very specific mid-storey native vegetation garden, and then we can remodel all the connectivity, get an understanding of the change in habitat connectivity and biodiversity outcomes. We can attribute a cost to each one of these circles to get an understanding generally of a cost and benefit sort of an analysis. It turns out, hypothetically, it might turn out that, if we green additional 30% of greenery on these spaces, that's going to cost us this much per unit. We're going to get this much of a benefit in habitat connectivity. This is the idea behind this project. It's really focusing on proposing realistic, practical planning approaches to improve biodiversity outcomes within cities like Greater Melbourne. And we're looking to be able to directly communicate with planning practitioners to inform on-the-ground practice and to sort of speak the language of local councils. So watch that space again with that project. I'm excited about where that one's going. I think generally speaking, just general notes, in cities like Melbourne, as Joe has said, increased densification means there's going to be less space within buildings for us to meet all the needs, social and ecological needs that we need, that citizens need, that nature needs within our cities. And so public and leftover spaces are becoming more and more critical. We need good quality precinct planning to achieve these sort of multifunctional spaces that support people living healthier lives, to support nature in cities, while still delivering on all the necessary sort of infrastructure. In order to get better planning of these spaces, it needs to be informed by great research, and I think that's why I think this is a great initiative, of course, and I'm excited to be part of it. So thank you for that.
And now I'll ask Rebecca to come up to give the last of our little snapshots of research. Rebecca is a professor formerly in the Post-Carbon Research Centre. She's taken up a prestigious research fellowship up the road at Melbourne University, and we wish her well. We'll, of course, continue to work together. It's so exciting to see what you're doing up there, but also to give you the opportunity to come and talk about this project with us here today. So over to you, Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the nice introduction. You still can say the logo is everything. It's about RMIT. As Joe said, I recently joined Melbourne University as a professor and Duran Thomas Fellow in the Department of Infrastructure and Infrastructure Engineering. But this project, I still keep managing this project at RMIT. We do have a big team at RMIT, and we have been working on this project for about a year or so. Hopefully, we can wrap up by mid of this year. It's a very ambitious project. So Andrew talked about buildings, and Hugh talked about the spaces between buildings. In this project, we try to cover everything in a precinct. And it's called Digital Twin-Enabled Sustainable Sunshine Precinct Development. We have a big team. That's the reason I didn't put everybody's name on this slide. We have more than 20 researchers working on this project. And some of them are within this room. And later on, you will hear further discussion from the panel discussion session. Laura, representing DTP, is here as well. So basically, the background is that the state government want to really further develop the Sunshine Precinct in the western suburb of Melbourne, and say to boost employment and investment livability through planning. They put a lot of ambitions in that area for the further development and to help the implementation of sustainability idea of this. I feel very lucky to lead this project because I personally don't see a lot of cases like this in Australia. This case, we look after a fairly big area. If you're familiar with Sunshine, we look after a fairly big area. We talk about hundreds of buildings, mid-rise buildings in that area, but we also include energy park and also infrastructure-related areas in that. So now the government, especially DTP colleagues, are very interested to see how we can throw digital modeling to support the sustainable planning. And we look into this project from different perspectives on that, which make it very complicated in a way. But the ultimate goal is that how we contribute to the Sunshine Priority Precinct Vision 2050 through providing a comprehensive analysis wide spectrum of sustainable urban design strategies. Everything is based on so-called digital platform, and with very strong support from DTP colleagues, including Digital Twin Victoria. We get the digital platforms or digital models for the whole precinct in the future planning. But of course, during this process, we also had a lot of discussions regarding the data format and also regarding how we set boundaries and assumptions for the analysis. But basically, we're looking to cover the climate change for the future in the simulation, and we also look into the public realm, water infrastructure, building, urban form, and energy infrastructure for that. Why it is important? That's why make me very passionate about this project, because I can see the government from very early stage of the precinct planning to take into a very comprehensive way and rely on digitalization to support this and provide feedback to the planning. So it's like a loop. They engage with researchers. We provide innovative simulations. We deal with huge data sets in the simulation so that we can provide instructive suggestions to planners and not only help them to really shape up the urban planning formats in that area, but also we are in the discussion regarding how we could help the government and the local council, et cetera, to attract more investment in that area. I think that's very important for urban planning as well. How we make it as an attractive place for sunshine, for people who want to live there, but also for commercial investment into that. So it means a lot of discussions with different stakeholders. Through our strong support from DTP colleagues, we have been talking with many government agencies and external stakeholders and try to refine our assumptions in this process. This is our overall picture. I'm sure you cannot read it in detail, even I cannot read the words, but in general, it shows that in the middle, we talk about a precinct level digital platform, as I said, with data model related to that. And the data source, not only from DTP colleagues, but also from other entities. For example, we are in the process to obtain the energy infrastructure from PowerCo as one example. So there are different data sources to support this. And we look into mainly 4 aspects for this project. One is urban height. I think Hugh just talked about the importance of urban height, and we want to understand in terms of the tree canopy and the public greenery area and also the building material, etc., the design of the building blocks in relation to the one direction, how that would affect urban height. We have done simulation on that. We also look into the water side. For the water, we didn't look into very complicated side for water. What we basically want to look into is about the water balance regarding the future rainfall supply for water and how we recycle the water and try to help the greenery area and trees and also probably some of the usage in buildings as well. And then we looked into embodied carbon, and Andrew leading that part with another colleague, Sajani here. So we looked into the buildings and say what's the embodied carbon related to the building design. And during this process, we engaged with Development Victoria and other entities, DECA, Solar Victoria, etc. We got some feedback. So that also linked to the last aspect, which is energy. So for energy, we look into the operation energy and equal that with the embodied carbon area and say what's the life cycle carbon emission for buildings. But we also look into the energy, potential energy supply from the buildings with PV and battery in different formats and EV systems, including electric bus. And what's the impact to the energy supply and demand, how we can optimize this, whether we should think about individual supply and demand into individual buildings, or whether we look into as a community level virtual power plant and what's the impact to the energy infrastructure. But the beauty of this project is not only about individual parts of this and the complexity within that. And the more interesting part for the researchers and for the external stakeholders is regarding the interaction between different aspects. I think Joe just mentioned at the beginning, okay, we need to really have a holistic view about the sustainable precinct development. So when we talk about urban height, it's related to the embodied carbon as well. We may change the building material, whether that would have impact between each other. When we talk about a lot of PV panels, would that generate a lot of urban heat or not? What's the impact related to that? So there are a lot of interactions for this. And what we have done so far is that we based on what we call a baseline scenario. Across the precinct, we have done the simulation across the 4 aspects. We can understand the interactions between the 4 aspects based on the base case scenario, but we are in the process to really change the urban format and build forms so that we can explore the impact with alternative designs from 4 aspects related to that. We are still undergoing, but as I said, we try to wrap up by mid of this year or later this year. Hopefully we can show you more results in the next time when we get more time. I hand over to you, Joe.
Okay, I hope you've got a sense of the exciting work that does go on within the Research Centre in deep partnership with collaborators in industry. Great setup. We're going to move over to the panel session now. So I would like to invite the 4 panellists to come up and take a seat on the stage. And I'll introduce you as you're making yourselves comfortable. So first of all, on my list, I've got Laura Little. So come on down, Laura. You can all come up. This is fairly informal, but I'm going to get through the introductions. Laura's a Senior Policy Advisor at the Department of Transport and Planning in the Activity Centres team, and she works primarily on the Sunshine Project and has been working closely with Rebecca and the team on that research that you've just been hearing about. Before that, Laura had experience in corporate sustainability consulting and a range of roles within state government, including before this role in bushfire management, where she was responsible for developing decision support tools that combined modelling data, social research and community engagement to inform decision making. Thanks so much for joining us, Laura. Next on my list, I've got Natash Palich at this end of the panel, who is the Executive Officer for the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment, or CASB, as it's affectionately known. Natash supports the collective action and advocacy of Victorian councils pursuing sustainability outcomes in buildings and within places in their municipalities. Through tireless advocacy, innovation and action, Natash and the team at CASB, working with local government, have helped build the evidence base, the policy tools and the decision-making tools to uplift sustainability outcomes in urban development. Then, next to Natasha, we've got Phoebe. Thanks so much, Phoebe, for coming. Thanks, Natasha, for coming. Phoebe is an urban planner with extensive experience across the sector, working in strategy development and vision setting and policy creation across state and local government and in the private sector, focusing at all times on empowering people with plans that inspire hope and positivity for the future. Phoebe recently joined the City of Melbourne, by recently, that's very recently, so well done there, to lead the 2050 Vision Project and has spent the previous 2 years working for the Minister of Planning in the Victorian Government. And then we have Trivess Moore. Associate Professor Trivess Moore is a leading housing and precincts researcher based in the School of Property and Construction and Project Management here at RMIT, and as I've already said, is the co-lead of the Precincts research cluster within the Post-Carbon Research Centre with me. His research explores the technical, social and governance dimensions of delivering sustainable and equitable housing and precincts. Round of applause for the panel. Going to kick off the panel with an opportunity for a minute or two each to add anything else you'd like to the context of our discussion here today. Could be about your role or your particular expertise or what you'd like to see spoken about today. And we'll go across the panel with that just to kind of get things going. And then I'm going to hit you with some questions. Is that okay? Okay, well, I'm going to start at the far end and come back towards me. So we'll start with Laura first.
Thanks for the introduction, Joe. I've spent the last 3 years working leading the sustainability work on development of Sunshine Precinct. And I suppose just to add context to the background that Joe put forward, which I think is interesting for people who are seeking to go down this field. I'm not an urban designer, I'm not an urban planner, didn't come with that background at all, which I think in Department of Transport and Planning is probably a bit unusual in the precincts area. And my expertise before coming here was actually in bushfire management in the Department of Environment and Climate Change, which probably also does not strike you as an intuitive fit for any of this work. But actually it's been quite an interesting journey. So when I was working in the bushfire management area, I saw the policy environment in that area really transformed by the use of simulation modelling tools. So the state government there, working with the University of Melbourne, developed a very sophisticated tool to model how bushfires moved in the landscape, what they impacted, and they found ways to quantify and measure that and visualise it in a way that was very compelling for stakeholders. So I saw that, and I saw how that really shifted a policy conversation from one that was about experts debating what to do and very blunt policy instruments around blanket plan burning to a much more nuanced risk-based approach and things that people could really wrap their heads around. So when I came into DTP with that background and was interested in sustainability, I really was interested in the use of simulation, and we're trying to plan for cities of the future. What's the world going to look like in 50 years, 100 years? How do we really visualise and grapple with that? Because it's very hard for people to put that together in their heads and really understand what it looks like. So the work with Rebecca has really been about how can we really get into the detail of what that needs to look like and what it asks from us as policymakers and planners.
Thanks, Laura. I'll come back to you on that in a moment, I'm sure. Over to you, Trivess.
Thanks, Joe. I think just to kind of reflect upon how research has kind of changed a little bit in my time here at RMIT, and I've almost been here as long as Joe and Andrew, and coming up to probably...
I'm still really young, I promise.
20 years of doing research in this space, but certainly when I started out, it was very much around new sustainable housing was my focus, individual housing largely, some apartments, but certainly in kind of the more recent years, it's been stepping into this space around, well, what happens when you go beyond individual buildings? Where are those opportunities for shared infrastructure, shared costs, shared benefits? But also focusing on the occupants and the users of these spaces, because we know that we need to bring the communities along on this journey with us, and if we don't, we get pushback, and we see what happens in the media when things get announced, when the communities perhaps feel they haven't been consulted with. And so we need to make sure that we're thinking about everybody who's using those spaces. And as Laura said, what are those spaces and places going to be like in 50 and 100 years' time? And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Trivess. I'm sure we'll pick up on that as well. Over to you, Phoebe.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I think kind of reflecting on some of the provocations that we heard earlier, one of the things that I've experienced through the course of my career working at kind of, municipal-wide strategies or statewide strategies or precinct-wide strategies is each time we prepare a plan, and especially when that plan is identified by government, that's usually a top-down process. So how you determine a boundary, you're basically identifying a place where you say change of some kind is going to happen within this boundary. What information are we going to take into that process to determine our readiness for change, how we're going to balance the kind of livability or sustainability or no carbon or zero carbon outcomes that we're looking for? What information goes into it? How are we sharing that information through that discussion, and then what comes out at the other end in terms of the type of place we want to see, how we want to feel, how we want to live, how we get around in those spaces. And so I think it's really interesting to see, all of that data that we can collect and what we can use to go on that journey together and understand our readiness for change, but then also appreciate the environment in which we're planning today, where people have access to lots of information. Not all of that information is coming from a reliable source. So how, as planners, can we be leaders in that conversation to actually answer questions like, how are we going to live? Can we afford housing? Can we breathe clean air? Can we have food and water security in the future? We're all kind of concerned with those things at the moment, but also grasping for information. So, the precinct offers us an opportunity to work at a community scale, to look for the information in the story we want to tell, the place we want to be in the future, and kind of, I think there's this imperative that I'm feeling on urban planners today to lead in that space and kind of help broker that conversation, and to take seriously the tension between that top-down process and the outcomes that community are looking for as well, and the obligation that government has to make decisions for the benefit of people in the future who don't have a voice yet in that conversation. So, yeah.
Lots to unpack for us there, Phoebe. Thanks for those opening remarks. Over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for having me. So I look after an alliance of local governments known as CASB, and it's a membership-based alliance authorised by the Municipal Association of Victoria. Our 44 members represent about 88% of the population of Victoria and about 80% of the planning activity. And their primary area of work that we look after is applying sustainable design principles in planning. My specific expertise is in holding a space for detailed experts to come together and practice a community of practice, if you like. And my role, I think, is to see where the synergies exist and then work out a way to bring them together. So CASB councils, we've had a long history of working on lot scale buildings, lot scale development, and but since 2015, led by the City of Wodonga, there's been a push to look at residential subdivisions, or subdivisions and then residential subdivisions in particular, through the development of a framework which we call the Sustainable Subdivisions Framework, which in turn is now informing the development of strategic work, so including the precinct structure plans of a number of our councils. So I know that this is greenfield focused, but I think that there's still a connection to retrofitting urban precincts here, because I've got a lot to say about process and bringing together and the sort of things that we need to do to deliver these things. So we've got a number of our councils working on precinct structure plans. There's a rolling workflow. There's many that have already been completed, but there's still an opportunity to impact those that are coming. And we're talking out of Melbourne, but we're also talking regional areas as well. And we've also seen, and I think we've got a lot of lessons to learn from, a couple of large precinct developments in inner Melbourne, Fisherman's Bend and I look forward to talking about that as well. But when I was asked to talk on this panel, I sort of had to have a little think about what I understood post-carbon to mean, a post-carbon precinct to mean. And so I think I just want to sort of set the scene a little bit, Joe, if that's okay. At a very basic level, I think it's about reducing carbon use and turning to sources of energy and materials that don't use fossil fuels. But then there's this conceptual approach to post-carbon, which is what does living in a low or a zero carbon or a post-carbon, if you like, society and economy actually mean? And what would we do with the design of our precincts differently in that environment? Like, what is it that would change for us living our lives in a post-carbon society? Would the way we move change, or would we just move to the same type of transport but sourced from a different fuel? Would the way our food come to these precincts be different? So I have a background as an architect, so I'm quite interested in the design implications of these spaces and buildings for this world. So there's the and design transition and production are the three themes of the precinct. But in addition to these ideas, I want to point out that for our member councils and for councils, it's really hard to think about precinct design without also thinking about the impact of the changing climate. And so a lot of the case studies that I've sort of got here to potentially talk about, are also about supporting adaptation and mitigation measures.
Thank you, Natasha. Wow, we've got a lot to chew through, but we've got a bit of time to do it. So we're going to get into some questions now, and I'm going to think where I'm going to go first. I might start with you first, Phoebe, and ask you to draw a bit more on your experience across, I guess, the different sectors, state, local, private sectors. I threw out a kind of provocation in the opening remarks that we don't do precinct level delivery that well. Maybe a bit of planning, but the delivery, not necessarily. So I'm wondering whether you've got any comment on that and what you might think are the kind of key needs to help deliver good, sustainable urban precincts.
Thanks, Joe. And I suppose because of the background that I've had in planning, my mind kind of goes to process and governance a little bit.
I'm all here for process and governance.
So apologies if that's not your jam. It's certainly mine, though.
I can see some students from governance and planning here. Shout out.
So we have this challenge if we're thinking at a precinct at a bigger scale, like a neighbourhood scale, of that fragmented land ownership. So if you own land, you have the ability to you have a lot of power over the decision to develop your land or not develop it, right? So if we have one landowner owning a big parcel of land, then they can set a really strong agenda for a post-carbon precinct or to do something in a conventional way. So, you know, there's this question of if in Australia the state government sets the overarching policy agenda that other plans are then responding to, what we ask for in that, or what state government asks for in that agenda setting is really crucial. So are we asking for, you know, things around, information to go into that plan making that helps us achieve a post-carbon outcome? If you're not asking that question at the start, or you're not compelling that to be part of the consideration, then you're asking the next person down the chain to have to insert that as an additional piece of work into the process. So certain people won't want to pay for that piece of work, certain people won't want to see behaviour change as a result of that work, and so we've kind of got to think through this, again, readiness to do something differently. So the precinct scale gives you an opportunity to innovate and to iterate, and also to not make a decision for the whole state when you haven't tested an idea yet. But then it also presents this challenge that you might have a wonderful outcome for that community and then move on to the next one and not be so sure of the outcome. So yeah, I do think there's a real challenge for us to consider when we're looking at cities to densify and we're starting from a very fragmented base, because even with a precinct structure plan, you're relying on people to decide to develop their land in line with that vision that you've set out. So, you know, that question of we can't compel people, so then what do we do?
I can compel them. Yes. All right, so it's tough. The context is tough, but it can be done. We can see it done in other jurisdictions. We can see elements in our own jurisdictions. But I'm going to lean into this idea of testing and experimenting and trying to innovate. I'm going to come to you, Laura. State government has a big role to play. You are not the state government. You are doing great work within state government. We've got these multiplicity of stakeholders, challenges with different landowners, different community interests, ideas about what their futures need to be. I'm interested to hear what you think, and you kind of hinted at this in your introductory remarks, what you think can help unlock the potential of the future in that really complex environment. What kind of processes and tools might help to do that? And I know that you're experimenting with some of them, so thinking about whether they're effective and if, you know, how and how not they're effective.
Well, I can't speak to all the tools, I suppose. I haven't been that involved in the governance side.
Choose on the ones that you're
I
playing
understand
with.
the community engagement component and the need to bring community along. That's really challenging in some of these, particularly, you know, shifting towards a higher density living that people may be less as part of our culture historically. I think what we've tried to do in DTP is use modelling as a tool to bring people together, and that can be a bit fraught. As Phoebe mentioned, you know, not everybody agrees with data, and that can be a real challenge. I think what we've really tried to do is not try and create a black box model. We don't give stuff to RMIT and say, go spend the next year calculating and then come back to us. It's actually more of a process of shared knowledge creation. So we've spent a lot of time working with Brimbank Council, with Water Corporation, with other stakeholders to say, look, we need to incorporate their knowledge into what our simulations look like. So all the energy simulations, all the water simulations, heat, it all reflects as much data as we could gather from the stakeholders we've been working with, and we kind of check that with them. So it's about reflecting people's knowledge back to themselves in a way. So you bring that, you bring different knowledge sets together and provide a picture back as to what those all add up to, because it's very hard for people to understand and put together, well, council's doing that and I'm doing that over here and a private landowner's doing that. How do you hold that in your head in totality? I think that's difficult. So what we've really tried to do is put all those things together, mix the pot and show, well, this is what we think it would look like if you put all these things, if council planted the trees that way, if the water corporations invested that way, if private developers invested their land according to the planning controls, this is what we think the future could look like. And reflect it back to people and say, is that what you thought you were getting? Is that where you want to go? And I think that's sort of using that as a tool to push the conversation forward. So it's not the only tool, and we're only measuring some elements around environment. So, you know, it doesn't take away from the need to look at a whole host of other issues, but it's about bringing some additional data and rigour to conversations that often end up being overly kind of general, I suppose.
Fantastic. I mean, that combination of the inquiry, the data, the evidence-led process through a process of engagement and co-creation is what's, you know, I see is really exciting about that project, and I'm sure I'll have a chance to comment more on it as we go along. I'm going to move over to you now, Natasha. Brimbank was mentioned there. Local government, in the case of Sunshine, you do a lot of work with local government. It's often where the rubber hits the road in terms of urban decision-making, particularly at the lot scale, but also how that comes together to build neighbourhoods, to build community. You mentioned what CASB has been doing, you know, coming out of that lot level kind of engagement to get better sustainability, built form outcomes, broadening to considering precincts through that greenfield space. Can you reflect any more on how those lessons might come into urban redevelopment, renewal, activity centre focus that we're seeing so much at the forefront of the housing strategy, of the planning strategy now here in Victoria? What can CASB bring to the table to say, we've learnt this is considerations, and I'm all here for governance and process?
So, look, I think one of the advantages of the Alliance, the CASB Alliance, is that it is a partnership that amplifies effort. So it amplifies a message, so in terms of communicating an ideal, but it also gathers together expertise and shares that out and amplifies effort in that way. I think that I've got some examples which I might talk to later, Joe, but I think that there's some lessons to learn about Fisherman's Bend and Arden. So I have a rudimentary knowledge of these, but what I do understand is that Fisherman's Bend has a really good sustainability framework. It actually has some really key elements in it, and there is a local ESD policy that has some things, and there's also an overlay, a planning overlay that has some other things. But what happened with that project was that the land was rezoned before that framework could come into place. And so there's, and after the land was rezoned, but before the framework came into place, a lot of people got their planning permits. And so, and then I'll get to the lessons, but then with Arden, there was a determination for that to not happen. And so there was a great deal of effort put into trying to make the planning framework quite solid in terms of environmentally sustainable design, but it didn't quite hit the mark in terms of, I mean, there's some good things in there, but not potentially as ambitious of what you might see in Fisherman's Bend. And so in both of those instances, you've got a really great framework, but sure, it'll apply to some projects, but not all. But and the issue, I think, was political in Fisherman's Bend, and then in the other one, you know, perhaps the ideals weren't quite realised in the outcome. And so I think what we can learn from that is that and you touched on it before, how it's easier to do that when you have one landowner or a single authority, I suppose, driving a process. But I think it's this cross-stakeholder commitment to a vision, and then commitment to realising that vision. I think what CASB's trying to do is learn from that process and use the levers that we do have to try and gather the good things that are happening in various parts and bring them together so that the whole can benefit. That's where we see that's one of our roles at the moment.
Great. I'm going to move on to you now, Trivess. This is a big conversation. I'm struggling to keep a hold of it in my own brain. I hope I mean, this is, whew. I'm looking for you at the audience to help me out here with some questions soon. I'd like to see you taking a few notes. Let's see what we can extract from this wonderful set of minds on the stage about the challenges of precinct development. But I'm going to switch to kind of this focus on evidence, knowledge creation alongside practice, Trivess. And maybe, you mentioned research engaging with the challenges of governance and process and of community engagement. I wonder if there's projects you could draw on that either you're involved on or research you're aware of where you think they're really doing good work to engage with that complexity of understanding the way decisions play out in redevelopment and who benefits from it.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think it's a really interesting kind of question about, what are those projects that perhaps are doing some really interesting things in the research space. And I think that research by its nature, you can do different things with it. You can respond to an issue that's out there, or you could be perhaps more proactive and help shape some of those discussions and those future directions of where we might be headed. I think what we know is, in particularly the sustainability space, things are changing really quickly and they need to change really quickly. And so a lot of that research is trying to stay kind of half a step or one step ahead of what's happening. And so I think that the projects that engage with, maybe it's the funder or key partners, key stakeholders, are those that are likely to be able to get outcomes that are going to be more kind of valid in terms of what they're able to achieve. And so we've heard from Rebecca and Laura about that kind of relationship in that project. To be able to further things there. It's moving quite fast, that project. But it's that kind of two-way discussion that's ongoing that's helping shape and guide and nudge that to the right outcome rather than kind of coming back a year later and kind of realising it might have kind of gone off in a different direction. I think the project that Andrew spoke about earlier on, the Nightingale Village project, I think is one that was really interesting in terms of it started out as, a per apartment, per building kind of focus, but actually the interesting things for us are what's happening across that precinct and the opportunities there for improvements. And I guess that through those discussions with Nightingale Housing and the key stakeholders involved in that project, we were able to better understand what was happening and why. So, we do a lot of talking to people in our research, and you talk to households, and they are naturally going to whinge about something that may or may not be all that relevant to the research. And so, it's part of our job, I guess, as those independent researchers to sift through that and kind of say, okay, well, what is relevant here for the questions that we are looking at? And it's interesting kind of talking to the people then involved in the design, construction, management of Nightingale Village about some of those things and trying to understand what could be improved moving forward. And on their behalf, they're really interested in, okay, well, if we've got getting some of these issues with CO2, we've got issues with noise, some of those things are challenges with the tools we use, the modelling, for example. Some of those challenges are with the train. We're not going to get rid of the train to make it quieter. And so what are the opportunities there to deliver? Well, for some residents, they're kind of worried about what might happen there, absolutely. But I think there is an opportunity to kind of validate what you find by engaging with stakeholders, with engaging with the community, because the worst thing, I guess, as a researcher is if you do a report, do a project, it sits on the desk, no one ever looks at it, no one implements anything. And so we need to make sure that research is really kind of action-focused.
Yeah, a great answer, and that interface between the technology, the design, and the actual use of the lived in, and how that is made real and actually resulting in the increased livability, increased sustainability, or not, as the case may be. So I'm keen to start bringing the audience in now. We're supposed to have a roving mic. I'm going to come in with a question while you get organised. Laura, I'm going to come back to you on the work you're doing in Sunshine. You've been talking about the use of the digital twin tool and that kind of process of engaging with stakeholders. This is not usual. It's not typical. And I'm sure it's taking a lot of effort, probably a fair bit of resources. But we are creating the spaces for the next decade, 2 decades, 5 decades, etc. here, and we spend a lot of money on all sorts of other things around infrastructure planning. Is there anything you're learning from this process that you feel should be starting to move to status quo in terms of how we think about getting really good, integrated, synergistic solutions for precincts?
That's a big question.
I love a big question.
Yeah, in terms of what we're learning, I think, as you were saying, it's been very labour intensive. Like on our DTP side, it's not typically what DTP would do, and it's been a very, very close working partnership that I think is unusual in terms of academic and industry engagement, at least from the government side. So my reflection is it's been a lot of work. Having said that, I mean, there's very sophisticated digital tools that exist out in the world and across the globe. There are people doing this stuff. It's not that it doesn't exist out there, but it's an effort for governments to build these sort of tools to work in the local context from a resourcing perspective. And it's also probably a cultural change. People might not start thinking that they actually need this. And it's only when we've really started, showing people maps that say, this is what we project your tree canopy will look like in 50 years. This is what we project the urban temperatures will look like in 50 years. People go, oh. So until people see the value of it and go, oh, okay, I see how I could use that or how that might be relevant. That's kind of step one. And the step beyond that is really the being able to create the tools, and as I said, there's a lot of it's been a lot of work, digital, both intellectual work and digital manipulation, and so probably if you're going to do this stuff more readily, you need those digital tools to be less manual, more automated, more capacity to do that stuff in a rapid way. But I think there's potential there based on the technology that exists sort of more broadly.
Thank you, Laura, for those reflections. Okay, I think we have at least a couple of questions lined up. I'm very excited to get questions from the floor. I ask that you keep them relatively brief, and if it's a comment, that's okay, but again, keep it relatively brief and respect the time that these kind people have given us in the way that you ask and pitch your question or comment. So you've got the mic down the front here? Great, over to you first.
My name is John Schoen. My private role is with Food Circle, a circular economy farming cooperative development, and I do that in Australia and in Denmark. But I'm also here as grounded.org.au. I'd like to thank Natash and Laura for bookending my question. The case study around Fisherman's Bend and Arden Macaulay of what didn't happen in spite of goodwill and intention. And Laura, your reference to human beings needing to be assisted to know where they are and where they might go and given permission to have some control in that process, some agency, is helpful. I'm very impressed by the panel and by the speakers, but I'm surprised at the lack of reference, or perhaps I didn't listen properly, but the lack of reference to nature and the baselining of nature and human settlement and the extent to which that which exists has been imposed upon. And so I'm wondering why I didn't hear about nature and the baseline from which we might sustain ourselves and the baseline of human health from which we might engage people in that development process.
Fantastic. So I think the question's about the role of nature, which I might interpret as natural systems, soil, vegetation, air quality, water quality in precinct redevelopment.
You've just technophiled it, yes.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I am a civil engineer by training, so that will happen sometimes. But, reduced but still serviceable. Okay, no, we're going with nature more generally. Okay, nature.
That was awfully neo-colonial, that embellishment. But thank you. I'm saying,
okay,
go back to first walking on land.
Okay, right.
As a contemporary rather than as a First Nations. Okay. And the extent to which the development process takes account of that light footprint, whilst all the referencing and the encouragement is to being sustainable and to being ecologically sensitive. But I haven't heard any of it.
Okay, all right, well, I'm going to go to the panel and see if you can help me out here. I think we're drifting into a kind of like it's a post-colonial critique of precinct development or nature broadly defined including First Nations people, obviously, I think is what you're getting at there. But I'll leave it at that.
I'm saying that whether it's greenfield or retrofitting, we, the citizens, are being invited to walk upon this land. Now, what came before has come before. We are here. And we're being asked to think forward. And I've got no reference to how we would engage first, principle, with the nature of the place, as it is as the City of Melbourne as a metropolitan.
Okay.
Or on the greenfield.
Any comments from the panel?
Yeah, I think there is, and I'm not sure again if I'm interpreting your kind of question, but I acknowledge the gap. That there's an opportunity to rethink the whole process for how, you know, what's our beginning point, and I kind of referred to this earlier when I mentioned that when we decide to make a plan, often that decision is a top-down decision and then it becomes a conversation that is, we're making a plan for this place, we anticipate some change here, you know, you can comment on this particular part of that change as community. And we've also created, you know, in general, I mean as a society, not me speaking as a government person, that we've got systems that are very kind of process-driven and very linear, and we don't look around at what an organic change process might be and what we can learn from the other systems around us and how they connect to one another. So I definitely think there's something in that, and there's a whole element of unlearning in there as well that I'm really interested in, but I wouldn't begin to pretend to be an expert in. But I love the provocation.
Can I just add, Joe? I think overarching, at least for the kind of the research that I do, is this urgency around climate change, but also in terms of the resources. Like, we know we're consuming whatever it is, 1.75 planets every year. And so from a kind of a nature, a resource perspective, you know, that should be underlying all this discussion that we're talking about. How do we get back to one planet living? How do we get back to almost rewilding our cities a little bit? And we've seen some examples where, you know, waterways that were concreted are now back to kind of being more natural. And I think that that's really important to think about. How can we try to deliver that at a retrofitting a precinct scale? And it might mean that some buildings we can't touch or we don't touch. It might mean others need to make way for, you know, parks or for farming opportunities or whatever it might be. But I think there's a lot there that we need to think through in terms of what is that longer term sustainability goal.
And Tash, do you have a quick comment? And the mic, there's a question down here, and any other hands up?
I think there's this tension between tension about how you achieve change, and so this research centre talks about design, transition, and production, and so there's this transition, this concept of transitioning to a post-carbon society, whatever that is, requires a paradigm shift. It requires a change of values, and you can see governments attempt to do that. Like, I genuinely believe that Plan for Victoria has tried to make a very big shift. It's come out last couple of what the driver is. It might not be my driver, but there's certainly a driver to expediently create housing. Like, that's a driver that they've attempted to achieve with this document. And so in my day-to-day work, I see planners, which is an idealistic, generally speaking, an idealistic profession where you're in it to really affect change to the way we inhabit our space, grappling with working within a system which you often don't have control over at a broader scale, and you're trying to affect change. And I can see councils trying to do this, and I acknowledge that this is within the existing system, but there are some good examples of councils trying to acknowledge and take into account the natural environment, and I say that not as I think you've implied, is with being at one with nature, but trying to enable a resurgence of nature in their placemaking. I can see that in the plans that are the precinct structure plans that I've had the opportunity to look into in the last couple of years. But I think it's really hard, and I think what you're talking about is paradigm shift. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Question up the back.
Yeah, thanks, panel. With the 50 or so activity centres now announced in Melbourne, are places like Box Hill and South Yarra seen as good examples by the people on the panel? If you could just comment on those two areas.
Is there a particular aspect of that you're kind of interested in, or just generally speaking as resolved
Box Hill and
precincts?
South Yarra seem to be the two areas that have really gone ahead as activity centres. Are they seen as good examples?
Okay, great. Any thoughts on the successes and failures of Box Hill and or South Yarra? Good on you, Phoebe.
I actually kind of want to reframe, and I don't mean this in a I'm skirting your question, but I kind of want to reframe it from a what might planning be trying to achieve by identifying activity centres perspective. And that is, we know in Australia, and especially, if we think about metropolitan Melbourne, I don't know if my mic's on, so maybe I'll just drop it.
I think it is on,
It is.
but certainly recorded.
Yeah. That we don't have very diverse types of housing here. And we've really for a long time gone on a trajectory of we're going to build one kind of housing, and now we find that from an infrastructure perspective, from a carbon footprint perspective, from a how long am I willing to spend in my car getting to work every single day perspective, that there are things that aren't working very well for a lot of people. And so we need to think about what options are available to us and how can we increase the choice. So it's not saying that any one kind of housing is better than another, but it's saying, do I have a range of options to choose from depending on how I want to live my life over the next 1 year, 5 years, decade until I get old. So to me, that's a really important reason for having a program like the Activity Centre program. Whether every individual building site by site achieves the kind of vision of the life we want to live is a question we'll debate until the end of time. But it is about, I think, a very important shift to say people deserve to have all kinds of choices for all kinds of housing at all different price points, and changing our mix is a really important step in that direction.
Thank you, Phoebe, for that. Where's the mic now? It's coming down the front, and then we've got a question up here.
And maybe quickly to add to that, maybe you should ask the people from Box Hill and South Yarra whether or not they like living in those places. Maybe they're a good person to start with to see whether or not they're successful precincts. My question might end up with you, Phoebe, answering it again, but also it's related to precincts, so certainly Laura and I always thought it was Natasha, but is it Natash?
It's Tash.
It's Tash. Either. Great. So my thought process is, we're talking about precincts here. Another way in which you might describe a precinct is a community or a neighbourhood. I want to put on a continuum, just a classic suburban neighbourhood, like Thornbury, where I live. And then on the other side, you have a full-on top-down precinct like Docklands. Docklands is obviously always a derided example, but nonetheless, I want to put it on the end of that spectrum. My thought process there is neighbourhoods are great because individual houses, people are able to enact, if they own the property, or even if they rent the property, they can change their environment from a sort of a bottom-up perspective. They can change they can develop a different house, they can renovate, they can change their garden. Whereas then when you look at a Docklands example, very top-down, very large sort of scale building, I always question how bottom-up actors, the local community, can start to influence their environment to make it reflect their communities and themselves. How do we, in our planning, as top-down planners, create spaces that somehow find a balance between those? We can't just have sprawling neighbourhoods, but develop some sort of precinct that allows for lived-in practices to amend them and change them with the community itself and with the growth of the community.
Question, Hugh. There might be multiple people, but might get Trivess to talk about Nightingale Village in that context, or other examples you know of.
Yeah, so a couple of things there, and I think that when we're talking about precincts, when we're talking about redevelopment, we're generally talking long time scales. You know, it could be 10, 20, 50 years in terms of getting to the end point of that initial kind of vision. And I think that it's really then challenging because we see changes in the way we use spaces, in buildings, in what we want in our communities. And so trying to build in enough of that flexibility to allow the community to take ownership, I think, is really important. But it's also quite challenging. Who do we listen to, and these types of things. And I think Docklands is an example where they wanted a lot of families to move in there and then kind of realise, there's no schools. What are we going to do there? And, we have to retrofit schools and these types of things. So you can make changes, but it does then mean that somebody might have to pay a cost at some point in time. At Nightingale, it's a different community. They're more attracted to that kind of model, but we did see at the village that, they would come together, they were doing things in the street, they would, doing planter boxes, they closed off some of the street and these types of things. So there are opportunities, I think, at different kind of levels to do things, and we do see quite a lot of passionate people out there in the community and trying to find ways to support them either through the planning system or whatever it might be, I think is really important. And so kind of thinking ahead, what is going to help those communities? Is it some sort of financial support that we can provide to help them make changes, a smaller or larger scale? I think is going to be really important to make sure these communities are livable, not just now, but into the future.
Thank you for those thoughts. Trivess, Tash?
Yeah, I do. You've made me think of a few things with that question, actually. Many years ago, the City of Adelaide did this project where they invited future residents of a community that they were developing to participate in the design of the community. So it was a very participatory design process. It was called Postcode 3000 or something like that, with the idea being that the future residents of this place would create the social capital, and so by participating in the design of the process, they would then be creating what makes a community, right? So I live in Thornbury, I know the community you're talking about, and the community is about knowing people in your neighbourhood and being able to see them as you move through the spaces. So I think there's about creating the social capital, but we all know the approach that's taken with Greenfield subdivision, which is you build the school before they come, you build the shopping centres before they come, you build the infrastructure. You don't actually get the train station, but let's say you put all that stuff in. It still often doesn't work. And I think this is where I want to circle back to these activity centres, because I think one of the things is density that makes spaces work, and having enough people on the street to be able to bump into them. So there's the physical infrastructure, there's the social infrastructure, there's the density, and then the final thing I would say is critical is the design between the spaces. So tall towers in a platform doesn't create usable spaces, but a Nightingale, which is still a high level space, has thought about those spaces in between the buildings that allows those accidental interactions, which is the key to successful urban interchange.
Phoebe wants to comment too, and then we've got one more question I want to get to.
I'll try and make it quick.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there is something in this, I love the term, and it's a technical term, but that idea of third place. So are there places in my neighbourhood where I can go for free and spend as much time as I like and, see other people and be attracted to those places because other people are there? And, I've done some work in some of the growth area councils in the past where we talked to community members about what was missing, and because a lot of the shopping centres, although they're delivered first, they're delivered on a pad site. So it's like supermarket, accountancy, other immediately population serving things, maybe a doctor goes there too in one of the small tenancies, and then there's a car park around it, and then housing. And so there are not sort of that place that I can book to have my birthday that doesn't fit at my home, but I want to have friends and family, or there's not a place for people to just kind of hang out at night time that feels safe and, it's along the street or it's a civic square. So some of those ingredients were missing, but I think that's starting to be better understood now, is you can't just kind of do a square of commercial and then leave that and imagine that people will make that work, because you need more sticky spaces. Yeah.
Now we're almost out of time, and there's some refreshments and snacks out in the foyer, I believe, to grab on the way out, or if you can stick around for a little bit of a chat. I've got time for one more question. You've been waiting. Oh no, two more questions. I'm sorry. It might only be one. Okay.
Hi everyone, thanks for the presentations and panellists and facilitator, of course. I just had a quick question about case studies. Where do we look to for best practice precincts around the world, particularly sustainable precincts that do preference retrofitting of existing buildings rather than, say, larger scale retrofitting of precincts, but then demolishing and rebuilding within that justified precinct development. Thanks.
Thank you. So examples of building retrofit or public space retrofit that you might like to call out as being really good.
So one that we've looked at previously is Super Local, I think it's called, in the Netherlands. And we were looking at that from a circular economy perspective. So there were it was a slightly larger area, existing community that was in need of revitalisation, and they kind of knocked down one tower before the key stakeholders involved thought, this is not the right approach to be moving forward. How can we do better with what we have here, including the materials from the building that they're in the process of knocking down? And so that's one that I think is really interesting, particularly because of that circular economy framing from it as well. But there are, I think, a range of examples from Europe, from North America, who have been doing some really good things. I think the challenge is finding those examples that are not new precincts, but that are kind of retrofitting. And some of this work is happening at one-off buildings or streets rather than at a kind of a larger precinct scale.
Quick one from Laura, yes.
I was just going to follow on from that, and I kind of want to sort of question the question a little bit, because I think I see a lot of reports come by, to government. There's these great examples in Amsterdam. We could do this in Denmark. This is amazing in Sweden, and it's really hard in an Australian context to get decision makers to see the relevance of some of those examples. So I think when you're talking about, there's so much great innovation in the world, I think it's going, what is relevant in the Australian context that will connect here? It doesn't have to be the exact same initiative. It might be the governance process they use or something more subtle that we can take away and learn. That doesn't mean we have to implement the exact same thing, but you can take some of the core underlying learnings and apply them in a kind of a nuanced way that feels practically relevant.
Yep.
Just to add to that, I think some of those learnings that are really tangible for the Australian context are how do we develop the industry around retrofitting? I would argue our retrofitting industry here in Australia at a per building level and a larger scale is not where it needs to be, and certainly is not able to develop or deliver retrofit at the scale and kind of speed that we need to. But we know that there are other countries who are doing much better in this space. Ireland is one of those examples with their kind of the one-stop shops, which are probably more for kind of housing, but there are examples of how you can develop a really robust industry so that we can have the relevant stakeholders come in and deliver what we want in Sunshine and in other areas.
Thank you for that, Trivess. I am going to call to a close the panel discussion there because we are to time. I want to, if you could join me in giving a round of applause to our panellists. Thank you so much, Laura, Tash, Phoebe and Trivess, and also to Andrew, Hugh and Rebecca for presenting. A big shout out to Monica, who's been helping get this event happening. Thank you so much. It wouldn't have happened without your support. To Nicole for comm support, to the AV guys and to the students helping with the mics and the ushering. Thank you so much. And most of all, thanks to you for coming along. There are some drinks and refreshments out in the foyer if you can stick around for a chat. Otherwise, there was some QR codes you can quickly snap. If you'd like to stay in touch on LinkedIn, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your evening.